All right, so we're back for part 2 of our Chapter 12 lecture where we're talking about community sentences, specifically probation, parole, what they call intermediate sanctions, and this phrase restorative justice, and we'll get to that. All right, so we left off here, and we were just talking about probationers' rights. And some of you are probably wondering, well, do they have any rights at all? And the answer to that is yes, but they are limited. So when you're talking about civil rights, the court has ruled that probationers have kind of what they call a unique status, and therefore they are entitled to fewer constitutional protections than other citizens. And here's a couple of kind of the bigger cases, if you will. So the first would be Minnesota versus Murphy, and here the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the probation officer-client relationship is not confidential. So it's not like, attorney-client, doctor-patient, pastor or priest to parishioner. It's just open. Okay, so they don't have that type of client relationship. So what they tell their probation officer is not going to be confidential. So if a probationer admits to a crime, then that information is going to be passed along from the probation officer to the police or the district attorney. And if you want to look at the actual case, OYA's again is a great website for you to go to, and I have the link to it here. All right, the next would be Griffin versus Wisconsin. And here, the U.S. Supreme Court held that a probationer's home may be searched without a warrant on the grounds that probation departments have in mind the welfare of the probationer and must respond quickly to the evidence of misconduct. So here, basically, when you are on probation, you have what they call search terms, and that could be your person, your car, or even your home. But this Griffin versus Wisconsin case does say that a probationer's home may be searched without a warrant on the grounds that probation departments have in mind, again, the welfare of that probationer, etc., and they want to respond very quickly to identify any type of misconduct. Next would be United States versus Knights. And here, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the legality of a warrantless search of a probationer's home for the purpose of gathering criminal evidence. Now, it was based on reasonable suspicion, and the condition of probation, as I mentioned a moment ago, is that they were basically part of their condition of probation was to submit to searches. So that's the rationale behind the United States versus Knights case. And again, if you want to read more, you can go to the OYA's website and check that out. Now, because placing a person on probation implies that probation will continue unless the probationer commits a major violation, the defendant has been given certain procedural due process rights at this stage of the criminal justice process. And I didn't want to go through each and every one of those, but you can look at each one of these cases in a little bit more detail. Okay, they're on pages 482 for 483. And just an example, if you look at the first one, Mempa versus Ray. So this, in this case, the court held that a probationer was constitutionally entitled to counsel at a revocation hearing or proceeding. So again, it's not relative to searches and seizures and things like that. It's more towards due process when it comes to revocation, and that's what all of these cases basically cover. So again, page 482 through 483. All right. So how successful then is probation? I mean, is it really even worth it? So we're going to take a look at some information. So National data or research basically shows that 65% of probationers successfully complete their probationary sentence. 30% are arrested, violate probationary rules, or basically abscond or flee. They run away, right? They try to hide, and they don't report. Now, most revocations occur for what they call technical violations during the first 3 months of a probation sentence. So, I mean, that's kind of interesting information, but it really is hard for, I guess for all of us to kind of figure, okay, so is that good? Well, let's talk quickly about a study. Okay, so, among those receiving probation are convicted felons, including, okay, rapists and murderers. I know that sounds horrible, but how do these more dangerous criminals fare in their community sentence? So in a classic study by Joan Petersilla and her colleagues at RAND, at the RAND Corporation, which is a great website to go to. It's a private think tank, if you will. And what they did is they traced 1,672 men convicted of felonies who had been basically granted probation in Los Angeles and Alameda counties, so two really big counties in California. And what they found was that 1,087, or 65%, were rearrested. And of those rearrested, 853, or 51%, were convicted. And of those convicted, 568, or 34%, were sentenced to jail or prison. Of the probationers who had new charges filed against them, 75% were charged with burglary, theft, robbery, and other predatory type crimes. 18% were convicted of serious violent crimes. And although the felony probation failure rate that was found basically seems kind of disturbingly high, right? The findings do still support the continued use of probation because people with similar criminal backgrounds who are sentenced to incarceration are more likely to recidivate than the community treatment group. So it's still a little bit up in the air, but they have found that, there are some things that we can do that can kind of help out the probationers, if you will. So even the most serious criminals who receive probation are less likely to recidivate than those who are sent to prison, okay, for committing similar crimes. So there's kind of an interesting, I guess, comparison, right? So let me read that again so you really understand that. Even the most serious criminals who receive probation, okay, are less likely to recidivate, get arrested again, go back to prison, than those who are sent to prison for the same type of crime or similar crimes. So probation, in essence, is working a little bit, and stability helps, of course, right? In any situation, probationers who are, let's say, married with children, have lived in an area for 2 years, for more than 2 years, are adequately employed, are certainly most likely to be successful. And young males who are unemployed or who have a very low income, a prior criminal record, etc., or a history of instability are most likely to be rearrested. And that sounds, it's kind of common sense a little bit, right? So what then could be some things that, or initiatives that might help shape the future of probation? Because some critics are worried that probation is now undergoing a shift from the traditional casework method that featured, the diagnosis and treatment to an emphasis on risk assessment and control, right? So you can see that there's a little bit of change there. So a number of initiatives are now ongoing or being suggested that might help shape the future of probation. And the first one would be making probationers pay. So a number of states now impose some form of fee on probationers to basically defray the cost of community corrections. And that could be in the form of like a day fee. And that's by definition a program that requires probationers to pay in part for the costs of their treatment. So that seems kind of interesting. The next one would be enhanced community engagement. So the New York City Department of Probation recently launched a series of neighborhood opportunity networks. And here probation staff basically in the target areas work with and in neighborhoods, basically neighborhood-based organizations, allowing them and the probationers they supervise to more thoroughly integrate with, educators, employers, service providers, etc. And the primary goal, of course, is to improve probationers. And then next would be area needs. Some experts suggest that probation caseloads, should be organized around area needs rather than client needs. Specialized probation. Some probation departments are experimenting with focused or specialized probation. So teams of probation officers basically take on clients convicted of one specific type of crime, such as drug offenses, domestic violence, rather than treating kind of a mixed bag of offenders. Next would be privatization, and this is a little bit controversial. Probation services have been privatized in some jurisdictions for more than 40 years, and the practice is now being used in at least 10 states, including Colorado and Missouri. Now, privatization also sometimes comes into for-profit. So those are some issues when people talk about privatization, that they have to be careful of the issues around for-profit, because in order to make a profit, you might have to cut corners in certain other, kind of areas. And then swift and sure punishment. The threat of swift and sure punishment that is, somewhat less than a full revocation of probation may help reduce those little rule violations. Hawaii, for example, has been experimenting with a system that provides immediate punishment for any probationers found in violation of their court order. So they're not going to wait around. That you get the punishment right away, and hopefully that would reduce or kind of send a message to others, right? That if they violate these terms and conditions, then they're very quickly going to be given some type of penalty or punishment. All right, so what are some of the other alternatives as we're starting to kind of wrap up? Well, probation is not the only alternative to imprisonment. An offender's sentence may include the requirement that he or she pay a fine or provide restitution, okay, which means if you damage somebody's property, that you pay that person back in order to have it fixed. And you may even have to repair it. It could be painting over graffiti, or it could be a fine. So these are different types of restitution, if you will. A convicted criminal may also have his or her property taken in a process known as forfeiture. And we already talked a little bit about this term called day fees. This is a program that requires probationers to pay in part for the cost of their treatment. So, it's kind of there's a growing trend to add sanctions to traditional probation sentences. And these programs can be kind of looked at as what they call probation plus, since they add kind of a restrictive penalty and condition above, or to the traditional community service orders, which emphasizes, let's say, treatment and rehabilitation more than control and restraint. And some of these so-called intermediate sanctions that we're going to talk about include programs that are administered by probation departments, and they would include things like intensive probation supervision, house arrest, electronic monitoring, restitution orders, something they call shock probation, split sentences, and even residential community corrections. So, there's a whole bunch of different ones, right, as it relates to probation. So, what are intermediate sanctions? These include programs that are usually administered by probation departments. And again, they're kind of a group of punishments that fall between probation and prison. All right, so again, it could be house arrest. And you can see here, this is what they call the kind of the punishment ladder. So you can see restorative justice, pretrial release, fines, forfeiture of property, probation, restitution, intensive probation, house arrest, monitoring, residential community center, split sentencing, prison, and then, of course, the death penalty at the end. But this is the punishment ladder. All right, so these are alternatives, right, to incarceration. And there are a lot of advantages to these. So although there's a concern that, these immediate sanctions will widen the net of justice and involve probationers in new, more intrusive and extensive programs, these probation plus sentences also provide a number of benefits not ordered or offered in basically traditional probation or incarceration sentences. So let's look at some of these advantages, if you will. So it could be, a cost benefit. Through, though somewhat more costly than traditional probation, intermediate sanctions are far less expensive to run than prison or jails. So it could be a cost benefit. Equitable community sentence. Intermediate sanctions help meet the need for developing community sentences that are fair, equitable, and proportional. So hopefully that kind of makes sense, right? And think about it. It seems unfair to treat both a rapist and a shoplifter with the same type of probationary sentence, considering the differences in their crimes, right? And that kind of makes sense. So equitable. Increase control. Intermediate sanctions can be designed to increase control over probationers whose serious or repeat crimes make a straight probation sentence kind of inappropriate, yet for whom a prison sentence would, be unduly harsh and counterproductive. So it can kind of be tailored, but you also have increased control. Some of the forms could be electronic monitoring, providing increased surveillance for probationers who might otherwise continue to commit crimes while in the community, etc. Reduce overcrowding. These intermediate sanctions can reduce the number of convicted criminals who might otherwise be incarcerated, but who, either pose a low risk of recidivism or are of little threat to society, such as kind of a nonviolent property offender. So for example, overcrowding in jails can be reduced by providing alternatives to incarceration for, let's say, misdemeanors and such. So that could be good, right? And then finally, used with different classes of offenders. So intermediate sanctions can potentially be used as kind of halfway back strategies, if you will, for probation and parole violators. Probationers who violate the conditions of their community release would be placed under increasingly intensive supervision before actual incarceration was required. And parolees who pose the greatest threat or risk of recidivism might receive conditions that require close monitoring or even home confinement. So parole violators could be returned to a community correctional center rather than a walled institution. So really, in sum, rather than being a kind of net widening measure, intermediate sanctions can act as a kind of a net repairing strategy. And we've talked about some of the different punishments on that punishment ladder. And then a couple other terms just to kind of talk about, and these are also punishments. Could be fines. This is money owed by offenders to compensate society for their misdeeds, if you will. We talked about day fines. This is a fine geared to the average daily income of the convicted offender to bring equity to the sentencing project. And many judges continue to incarcerate offenders for noncompliance with financial orders, despite the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Tate versus Short. And that's kind of an interesting case when you talk about the Tate versus Short case. So I'll let you kind of look at that one on your own. All right, so forfeiture is another alternative to imprisonment. So the seizure of personal property by the state as a civil or criminal penalty. And either civil or criminal, it is also available as a means of targeting crime. Both seek to take the profit out of crime, right? Criminal forfeiture proceedings target criminal defendants and can only follow a criminal conviction. Civil forfeiture proceedings target property set in a crime, if you will, and do not require that basically formal criminal proceedings be initiated against a person be proven guilty of a crime. So civil is different than criminal. Restitution, we talked about this. Another popular alternative to incarceration is restitution, a condition of probation in which the offender repays society or the victim of the crime for the trouble the offender inflicted. And it could be monetary or in the form of, let's say, community service restitution, where you're picking up trash on the side of the freeway or painting over graffiti or these other types of services. Shock probation and split sentencing. These are alternative sanctions designed to allow judges to grant offenders community release only after they have basically sampled prison life. So a split sentence basically requires convicted criminals to spend some time, a portion of their sentence behind bars, and then the remainder in the community. And shock probation puts offenders in prison for a short term before they begin their probation to basically impress upon them the pains of imprisonment. So these are some different, again, alternatives to imprisonment. There's intensive probation supervision, a type of intermediate sanction that involves small probation caseloads and very strict monitoring on a daily or weekly basis. And the goals of intensive probation supervision are typically basically, control, decarceration, control, and reintegration. So these are the goals of those types of things. Now, decarceration by definition, without intensive supervision, clients would normally be sent to already overcrowded jails. Control basically is where, high-risk offenders can be maintained in the community under much closer security, if you will, than traditional efforts. And reintegration, this is where offenders can maintain community ties and be reoriented towards a more productive life while avoiding the pains of imprisonment. So these are the goals of intensive probation supervision. House arrest, this requires convicted offenders to spend extended periods of time in their own home as an alternative to an incarceration sentence. Electronic monitoring frequently accompanies house arrest to ensure that they are compliant, right? That they're staying where they're supposed to be. And it might even be a time frame. So, it could actually be, something such as from 6 p.m. on Friday until 8 a.m. on Monday. So there could be time frames applied to that. And here convicted offenders basically wear a monitoring device as part of their community sentence. Residential community corrections, this is the most secure intermediate sanction. So and basically by definition, this is a facility that houses probationers who need a more secure environment. So it's not a prison, but it basically is kind of a non-secure facility located in the community that basically, takes in or houses those probationers who need a more secure environment. And typically residents are free, during the day to go to work, school, or treatment. But then they have to return in the evening for counseling session, meals, etc. So that's a community, basically residential community corrections. Day reporting centers, these are non-residential, meaning you don't live there. Community-based treatment programs, so you basically go there for the day, okay? And it might be for learning how to use computers, or applying for jobs, or doing other type of programs, if you will. And then finally, we're going to talk about restorative justice. Now, it's kind of an interesting concept. It's been around for a while, but it is a little bit different if you haven't really talked about it. So one of the goals of contemporary sentencing is to restore offenders into society, right? And this goal has particular relevance today because many crime experts believe that, ironically, rather than reducing crime and recidivism, policies based on getting tough on crime, even intermediate sanctions, can cause crime rates to fluctuate higher and offenders to commit more crimes. And punishment may not work because it both carries, the hard to erase stigma and destroys the offender's dignity and peace of mind. Now, keep in mind these programs only work for certain individuals, okay? So just kind of bear with me as we talk about this because it is a little bit new. Now, when traditional community-based correctional models such as probation are supplemented by the new alternative, intermediate sanctions, the effect is to add a punitive aspect that can further hinder rehabilitation efforts. Now, instead, restorative justice advocates basically suggest a policy based on restoring harmony to the damage caused by crime and creating a system of justice that includes all the parties harmed by the criminal act. And that will include the victim, the offender, the community, and society. So it's kind of interesting, right? So, the concept here is basically that everybody kind of gets a say in what goes on. The person is admitting what they did. The victim feels better because the person admits. There might be some fines and different things, but everybody is in this at the same time, right? So it's kind of different. So by definition, to kind of make it easy to understand, restorative justice is a view of criminal justice that focuses on crime as an act against the community rather than the state, and that justice should involve all parties affected: victims, criminals, law enforcement, the community. So kind of an interesting concept, right? And that's the restorative justice component. And what goes along with that a little bit is finally what they call the concept of restoration. Okay? And according to the restorative view, even though crimes can seem quite different, ranging from, let's say, a violent assault to a white-collar fraud scheme, they all share one common trait. That is, they inflict harm on the community in which they occur. Now, and yet the traditional justice system has done little to involve the community in this justice process, and has not adequately involved the victim in the justice process. So the concept of restoration is that all crimes bring harm to the community. What is needed is repair, accountability, and healing. So it's a little bit different, right? So these are some kind of different programs that are actually showing, some success in certain areas. And again, when you talk about restoration programs, the offender, there's offender recognition of harm. There's offender commitment to reparation, right? And then community support for the victim and the offender. So, with all of that said, there are many challenges to this, kind of restorative justice, if you will. Evaluation of these programs has been questionable thus far. Balancing the needs of offenders with those of victims can be a little bit challenging, right? And then, we ask the question, do these programs reach out to all members of the community, including minorities and those of cultural and social differences? Or is it just a certain individual? So again, these are all things for us to consider as we wrap up. So a lot of terms, a lot of interesting things. If you didn't know a lot about probation and parole, hopefully you do now. And we made it pretty much under our time frame. But with that being said, that's going to conclude part 2 of chapter 12, community sentences, probation, parole, intermediate sanctions, and restorative justice.